I'm Katherine Gibson for Insight. Today I'm joined by Deborah Scroggins, author of a new book, Wanted Women, Faith, Lies, and the War on Terror. Deborah, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about the book and what led you to exploring these two women's lives.
Well, the book tells the story of two extraordinary women. One is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and she is the Somali-born author and activist who was notoriously threatened with death for her criticisms of Islam. And her sort of polar opposite, Aafia Siddiqui, who is a Pakistani neuroscientist who for a long time was the only woman wanted for her association with al-Qaeda and was eventually sentenced to 86 years in prison for firing at U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan.
Even though their lives never intersect and they've never met each other, you do note in the book that each of their lives has mirrored or could have doubled the other's life in some way, one becoming a militant Islamist, the other becoming a westernizing feminist. What were the turning points for each in their lives that set them on these paths?
Well, that is one of the extraordinary things about them, and I think it's because they come from the same generation of highly educated Muslim women. So they both came under the influence of Islamism, the political ideology calling for Islamic states based on Islamic law. Ayaan Hirsi Ali briefly belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood, to a Muslim Brotherhood youth group when she was a teenager. Meanwhile, Aafia Siddiqui studied feminism when she was a student at MIT here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, when she came to the Netherlands and she sought asylum there and eventually went to university on her own, and as she describes in her book, Infidel, it was a gradual sort of opening to the West, which changed her views, and she eventually became quite critical of Islam and pro-Western. Aafia Siddiqui was here in the United States, and she gradually became more and more involved with Islamist and eventually jihadist groups, and then slowly became more and more critical and began to see America as the enemy.
Ayaan doesn't really make a distinction between Islam and Islamism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that's because that's the way she was taught when she belonged to this Muslim Brotherhood group as a teenager. She was taught that that is Islam, and that all the people who believe in a more forgiving, gentle sort of Islam, more conventional Islam, that those people just really don't understand their own faith, and they're just wrong.
Can you talk a little bit about her marriages, her life experience as an immigrant, applying for asylum in the Netherlands, this view of Islam that she has? How did she take all of that and become this celebrity in the Netherlands?
She was trying to get a job working for the Labour Party's Research Institute because her friends told her she'd be perfect for that job. And around that same time, there was an imam in the Netherlands who was saying that homosexuals should be sentenced to death or something like that. And so she wrote an op-ed saying that this attitude was very common in Islam, and it appeared in the newspaper. And that was her first success. That was when, and very shortly after that, she got the job. And after 9/11 happened, she began writing and speaking out about how Islam was in the Dark Ages and needed an enlightenment, and that made her very popular. She quickly started to go on television shows, and soon she was threatened with death for saying that Islam was backward. And when that happened, that catapulted her to national fame.
I'd like to move on to Aafia's life because it presents some very interesting contradictions about feminism and Islam. She's this very unique mix of a jihadist who's neglecting her husband and her children so that she can be a jihadist. How did she reconcile all of those contradictions in her own life?
Well, she wasn't able to reconcile them successfully. I mean, her first husband divorced her, and he had tried to argue with her Islamically and to say that her duty was to submit to him as a wife and mother and, accept his advice or his demand that she give up this jihadist stuff, and she refused. She said that it was more important for her to pursue that. So he divorced her. Then she married the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a young man called Ali Abdul Aziz Ali, and she agreed to go on a mission for him, even though she was leaving her newborn child behind and her 2 other children. And one can only assume that she did that because she believed that that mission was more important than her duty to take care of her children.
There's a lot of debate about what role she played in al-Qaeda. What did your research find, and where do you think she went to for that missing length of time when she disappeared?
I think the time when she could have been actually dangerous to the United States was the time when she was working together with the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, because that family, the family of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, were the single most effective terrorist family that al-Qaeda ever had. I mean, they were the ones who masterminded 9/11 and dozens of other attacks. So if anybody could have turned Aafia into a real threat, it was them. She told the FBI that she was in hiding, and that she had been working for a cleric called Abu Lubaba in Karachi, and she was also captured with a whole bunch of papers that suggested she had been working on various projects. For example, there was one that had a diagram of how to build a dirty bomb. There was another paper talking about how to alter viruses. But her lawyers argued that all of these documents were really more kind of like ravings than serious scientific plans that could be carried out. So I think really the time she was dangerous was not during that missing period. I don't think she had the capability to do that much on her own.
And she eventually became the focus of demonstrations in Pakistan, and she has a very controversial role in Pakistani attitudes. What does that say, her case, about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship?
Well, it shows the enormous level of distrust between Pakistan and the United States, because Pakistanis do not believe that Aafia's arrest in Afghanistan in 2008 was just the sort of accident that Americans describe it as. What the United States and the Afghan police have said is that they just happened to find Aafia and her son sitting outside of a mosque in Ghazni, the town of Ghazni in Afghanistan. And when the Americans came to question her about what she was doing there, she picked up a loose rifle and fired it at the American soldiers and Afghans who had come to question her. And that's what she was eventually tried and convicted of. But Pakistanis don't believe that at all. They believe that the whole thing was a setup and that she was actually held in a secret prison during those missing years. And so she's considered to be a symbol of Pakistan, the way Pakistan's been trampled by the U.S. during the war on terror.
And where is she now?
She's now serving her sentence at the Federal Medical Facility in Carswell, which is outside of Fort Worth, Texas.
Each of these women in some way embodies what people want to believe about the war on terror. Yeah. What do they mean for you after all of this time you've spent studying them?
The more I got into it, I found that what was really more important was their attitude towards the West. Aafia it's accepted that she basically broke every rule in the Pakistani playbook for women. That's okay because she's perceived as having stood up to the West. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, lied on her to the immigration authorities in the Netherlands and, has in other ways sort of, gone against what you would think the conservative preference would be. And yet she's revered because she's seen as a champion of the West. So I found that that was actually more important than any particular position that they took on women's rights.
Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming to speak with me today, Deborah. I appreciate it.
Thank you for this excellent interview.